They said she was just a girl, quiet, strange, maybe grieving someone she barely knew. And when the wind picked up on that first morning, and Ava Lynn didn't flinch, not even when her sketchbook pages tore from her lap and scattered across the grass. The groundskeeper figured she was just another visitor chasing a memory she didn't really have. But on the fourth day, when the black SUV pulled up and the man in dress uniform stepped out, chest gleaming with medals, posture carved from steel, and dropped to one knee before grave 241, B, the story changed. Because 4 days earlier, no one had paid her much mind. Not when she sat cross-legged in the cold by a weathered military headstone. Not when she laid a folded cloth before kneeling like it was sacred ground. And certainly not when she began reading aloud from letters no one else could hear. And if you believe that silence can carry truth, and that no soldier's story should ever be buried with them, then like and subscribe, because this story isn't just about a grave. It's about the voice that waited beside it. She was small, barely 23, with a tightly wound bun, a faded green jacket that hung off her frame, and a stillness so sharp it made the crows hesitate. The old man in the office, the one who logged cemetery records by hand, squinted at her through the blinds and muttered, "That's Lynn's girl, I think," before coughing into his thermos and saying no more. What no one knew, what she hadn't told even her mother, was that 3 weeks earlier, she'd pried open the rusted shadow box tucked into the bottom drawer of her late grandfather's apartment, sealed since 1972. Inside, a folded letter on official parchment with a watermark, metal she couldn't identify with ribbons bleached from time, and a note addressed simply, "For the one who still believes." It was signed by General Carson Wills, a name that hadn't meant anything to her until she searched it. And that was what brought her here. Every morning at 6:45 sharp, same bench, same posture, same sketchbook in hand. She never brought flowers. She never touched the headstone. She just sat, eyes on the dirt, reading from the letter beneath her breath like scripture, letting the wind carry pieces of it. And the grave 241, B, wasn't well known. It bore no markers of valor, no flags, just a plain etching. Major Nathaniel Lin, 1935 to 1972. The world had moved on. Ava hadn't. On the second morning, the janitor found her sitting through a light drizzle, unmoved, her hand tracing the air as she tried to sketch something into her notebook. On the third morning, a small boy visiting his uncle's grave asked if she was praying. "Not yet," she whispered. "I'm waiting." By then, the cemetery staff had started murmuring, not out of malice, just confusion. Some figured it was a school project, others an emotional stunt. But to the retired groundskeeper, Mr. Howard, there was something deeper. He'd worked there long enough to know what real grief looked like, and hers didn't have tears. It had patience, resolve, stillness. So when she nodded at him one morning and asked, "Did he ever get visitors?" and he answered, "Not in decades," something in her just nodded back. She didn't need confirmation. She already knew. Because she wasn't mourning a man she remembered. She was honoring a truth no one else had bothered to see. That's why when the black SUV arrived on the fourth day, its windows tinted and silent, and when the driver stepped out, a young uniformed man with a clipboard and uncertain steps, followed by a tall, imposing officer with silver streaking his temples and a chest of medals that gleamed against the gray morning, everything stopped. Mr. Howard dropped his rake. A nearby widow gasped. The officer, General Carson Wills, walked with no hesitation past rows of decorated heroes and straight toward Ava, who didn't rise, didn't speak, just looked up as he approached. He knelt beside her like it was the only posture that mattered. "Miss Lin?" he asked, voice steady. "Yes," she said. "You got my letter?" He nodded once, then removed his hat. And when he reached into his coat and pulled out a black leather binder, thick, stamped with military insignia, and marked classified release, cleared for family. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He set it beside the grave without ceremony and said just one thing before rising. "He saved all of us. They just never told you." Then he stood, saluted the headstone, turned, and left. No cameras, no press, no parade. Just truth, delivered quietly at dawn. That was the moment Mr. Howard realized the world had gotten it backward. The story didn't begin with medals or speeches. It began with a girl who sat quietly, who listened to silence, and who believed a forgotten man deserved to be remembered. Ava didn't speak much after that. She just opened the binder, page by page, until she found what she needed. She traced the old deployment maps with her finger, recognized the initials that matched the medals in the box, and when she stood to leave, she whispered just one thing to the grave. They know now. She left the sketchbook behind, tucked against the headstone. It held no names, no dates, only drawings. One of a shadow box, one of a soldier kneeling in the rain, and one of a girl, sitting alone, not crying, but waiting. Because sometimes, remembrance looks like silence. And sometimes, silence speaks loud enough to wake the dead. They didn't announce his arrival, didn't clear the grounds or shut down the gates, but everyone noticed the moment he stepped out of that black SUV. General Carson Wills didn't need introductions. The ribbons on his chest read like citations carved into stone: valor, sacrifice, command. But it wasn't the medals that silenced the maintenance crew or stopped the young mother laying lilies for her brother. It was the expression he wore, not of superiority, but of apology. Weathered and quiet like a man rehearsing a speech he never wanted to give. Ava was already sitting by grave 241. B when he approached, her head slightly bowed, sketchbook closed beside her, the binder still resting on her lap like a weight she hadn't yet decided to lift. She didn't stand. He didn't expect her to. "Miss Lin," he said, voice low but clear, like he had practiced her name. She looked up, and her answer was quiet: "You came." For days earlier, she hadn't known his name. Now she'd read every one of the 37 pages in that declassified file, every redacted paragraph, every casualty report, every operational log of June 12, 1972. When Major Nathaniel Lin defied a direct order to bomb what had been misidentified as a hostile encampment and instead led a ground team into the jungle to extract civilians, 27 souls who would have died otherwise. One of them, a second lieutenant named Carson Wills. He had been 22 then, lungs full of smoke, panic blinding him, when Lin threw him over his shoulder and carried him 3 clicks through enemy fire. The Army had buried the story. Command had reprimanded Lin for insubordination and quietly transferred him stateside. He never got another deployment. No court-martial, no media, just a quiet burial of a man who saved lives by breaking rules. Ava knew all this now. Knew why her grandfather never talked about Vietnam. Knew why the medals had no labels. Why the shadow box had been sealed with a bent nail and wrapped in cloth. The general knelt beside her, not on both knees, but on one, like you do at a flag-draped casket, and removed his hat with the reverence of a man addressing someone far above his rank. "He was my commander," he said, eyes not on her, but on the grave. "I should have come sooner." Ava stared at the granite slab, the name etched there so plainly it almost hurt. "They made him feel ashamed," she whispered. "All he did was save people." Wills nodded once, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached into the inner lining of his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, military insignia pressed into the flap. "This," he said, "was written the night before the extraction. He asked me to deliver it, but I never got the chance. I didn't think I deserved to." He placed it gently on top of the binder. Ava didn't touch it. Not yet. Around them, the cemetery was silent, the morning fog hanging low across the marble stones like breath held too long. The general stood slowly, bone stiff, and looked down at the grave with a gaze that had seen too many names fade before their stories were told. "The men from that mission. We've been gathering every year. We never forgot. But we never had the courage to make it public. Until your letter." Ava blinked, her hands tightening around the edge of her coat. "Why now?" she asked, not accusing, just broken. He didn't answer at first. Just let the question hang there. Then, finally, "Because your letter didn't ask for vengeance. It asked for truth. That's something we all owed him." And with that, he turned, saluted the stone with one crisp, deliberate motion, and walked back toward the waiting SUV. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The door closed behind him with a soft thunk, and the vehicle disappeared down the gravel path like a memory pulling away. Ava sat for a long time after he left. She opened the envelope slowly, fingers tracing the seal as if it might crumble. Inside was a single page. Her grandfather's handwriting was neat, military clean. The letter didn't begin with "Dear Ava," or "To my family." It began with a date. June 11th, 1972. And it ended with, "If this is ever found, tell them I did it for the children. Not because I disobeyed, but because I remembered what it felt like to be one." She folded the letter carefully and slid it into the binder. Then, finally, she stood. She walked to the headstone and touched the top edge, just briefly, like sealing a pact. From the parking lot, Mr. Howard watched with his hat pressed over his heart. He'd seen war heroes buried in silence. But this was the first time he'd ever seen one remembered in it. And he knew then, what the others would learn later, this wasn't the end of Nathaniel Lin's story. It was the beginning of someone else's. Someone who now carried the weight he had buried quietly for half a century. The next day, reporters would arrive. The file would be leaked. The medals identified. And veterans from 3 different units would come forward to confirm the truth. But for now, it was just a girl, a grave, and a letter too long overdue. The silence spoke louder than any anthem, and it would echo for years. By the following morning, word had started to leak, not from press releases or official memos, but from whispers, shared glances, and blurry phone photos of a decorated general kneeling beside a forgotten headstone. Cemetery staff didn't speak to the news vans parked across the street, and Ava Lin didn't return to grave 241B for 2 days. When she finally did, the sketchbook was gone, but in its place was something far heavier, a bronze placard freshly embedded in the soil, military issued, flanked by 2 miniature flags. It read, Major Nathaniel Lin, Defender of Civilians, Operation Hallowed Bridge. Classified service recognized, June 1972. Below it, a quote etched in subtle italics, sometimes honor whispers instead of shouts. Ava knelt slowly, brushing her fingers over the engraving, and beside her, wrapped in waterproof casing, was the binder returned and sealed, now accompanied by a second envelope. Inside was a letter, not from her grandfather this time, but from General Wills. Your grandfather was a silent giant, it began. I have submitted his record for posthumous commendation. It will likely take months. Red tape, legacy systems. But I wanted you to have this first. Enclosed was a photocopy of an internal memo from 1972, never meant to be seen, and unsigned, typewritten note acknowledging Lin's insubordination but concluding with, results save lives. Opting not to pursue disciplinary action due to mission optics. Recommend reassignment to avoid political fallout. Ava read it twice, then folded it in half and placed it under the placard like an offering. That night, something shifted. At first, it was just veterans, older men, mostly, walking alone, some in faded caps, some in silence, appearing at 241B, standing a few minutes, then leaving without a word. Then came the survivors. One by one. The children he had saved, now adults with gray in their hair, some carrying photos of themselves in jungles they barely remembered. They didn't call it a memorial. No speeches, no podiums. Just chairs placed quietly around the grave, a silence kept like church. Mr. Howard started bringing extra folding seats. No one asked him to. He just knew. Eventually, someone put up a canvas tent when rain threatened, and another brought a thermos of coffee, labeled simply for Major Lin's watch. Ava kept returning. Not every day, but often enough that others knew when to expect her. She didn't talk much. Just listened. To stories. To silence. To the soft footfalls of respect. One afternoon, a group of recruits from a nearby base came unannounced, dressed in crisp uniforms, carrying with them a plaque of their own. They'd heard about the man who broke the rules to save lives, and they wanted to learn how to leave like that. Ava watched from a distance, unseen, as the platoon stood in formation, saluted, and quietly left behind a single handcart sign that read, "We train where you walked." But it wasn't until a year later that the silence finally gave way to something louder. At a national remembrance ceremony held at Arlington, a speaker paused mid-sentence and read aloud a name not on the original roster, Major Nathaniel Lin. Posthumous citation. Medal for distinguished gallantry. Ava watched on a live stream, curled up in her apartment, her grandfather's old dog tags now hanging from the rearview mirror of her car. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Because he had been seen. Because she had made him visible. Because the grave no longer whispered alone. The next day, at the cemetery, the tent was gone, but a small wooden bench had been installed, funded anonymously, with only 5 words carved into the backrest. She waited. And they listened. Ava sat there that evening beneath a fading sun, sketchbook back in her lap, not drawing anything in particular, just tracing lines that curved like memory, like legacy, like weight finally passed forward. A little girl walked past, holding her grandfather's hand, and asked, did she know him? The old man looked at Ava, then at the grave. She knew what mattered, he said. And that was enough. Because heroes don't always wear medals when they're alive. Sometimes it takes someone else, quiet, patient, unshaken, to remind the world what silence was trying to say all along.